Hey Ainsley, what's up? So, hey, something exciting's going on tonight. All right? Oops, let me fix that. That's weird. Okay, so tonight we're starting something very new that we've never done before. We're going to read, but we're going to read like a big grown-up book, kind of. All right? One with mostly words and not as many pictures. And this was sort of your request because you and I spent a little bit of time last weekend watching Harry Potter. Oh, no, don't touch that. That's the bookmark. We're going to talk about the bookmark in a minute, okay? So we watched Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and you were very interested in it. And so I picked up not the actual book, but I picked up the illustrated version of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And this is by J.K. Rowling, all right? And I, a long time ago, started reading all the Harry Potter books kind of right around the time they were sort of getting popular. It wasn't like it is now, which is crazy. And there weren't movies. But I was a guy I worked with at the beach that I used to work at in Massachusetts. And he was reading them, and he was telling me how great they were. And so when he was done, I asked if I could borrow them, and I read them too, and I liked them. Of course, there was only like maybe 2 or 3 of them out at that point. Anyway, I've read all of them. I've seen all the movies. I think what you and I are going to do is we're going to start to work our way through this book. It's a lot of pages, so we might not get through it quickly, but anyway, but there are some photos, pictures rather, which is good. So the dollar is going to be our bookmark, okay? So that's what that's for. So this is Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and it's written by J.K. Rowling. Let me show the picture again. See? And it's not the actual book, but it's, I think, pretty close. But I think it's written more for, kind of your age. So anyway, all right. So we got lots of chapters to get through. So I think we're going to try to get through chapter 1 tonight, which is called The Boy Who Lived. And there are 17 chapters. So we're going to put this... Oh, you're going to see in a minute. Listen very closely.
Who is that?
That's Dudley. Okay?
Does he cry every day?
Yeah, but listen. Ready? Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with much nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the unusual amount of neck. Which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences spying on her neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son named Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out. The Potters, Mrs. Potter and Mrs. Dursley's sister, Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in their street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never ever seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. And when Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hammered as he picked out his most boring... my eyes are terrible. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work. And Mrs. Dursley gossiped, "Can we not pick our nose and eat it, please? See, this is being recorded. One day, you're going to run for President of the United States, and this video is going to come out of you picking your nose and eating it during story time." None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the wall. All right, little tyke, chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of the number 4 drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. A cat reading a map? For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said, Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats can't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the unusual morning traffic, he couldn't help notice that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw on these young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his finger on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man has to be older than he was. And he was wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings parking garage. His mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed at owl after owl, speeding overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at nighttime. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them stop next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back to them, clutching a large donut in his bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters. That's right. That's what I heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead in his tracks. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down, nope, and stroked his mustache, thinking, nope, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. And there was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her. If he'd had a sister like that, all the same, those people in the cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. And when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone. Oh, where are you going? Are we done reading for the night? Okay. Are we done? Okay. Where are you going? Oh, you're just going to get your milk? Oh yeah, you forgot to finish your milk. Good call. Good call. Good call. All right. You enjoying the story so far? Yeah. Okay, good. Good, I'm glad. All right. Found it a lot harder to concentrate, blah, blah, blah. Sorry, he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. Violet, like our dog. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passersby stare, "Oh, don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day. And the man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted on the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the same tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problem with her daughters and how Dudley had learned a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normal. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusual today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in the daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping patterns. The newsreader allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious. And now, over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Okay, do you want to keep reading or do you want to stop? Because we're halfway through this chapter. This is a good place to stop. We've been reading for like 10 minutes. Want me to keep going? Okay, keep going. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain. Owls flying by daylight. Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place. And a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear? You haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley fumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So? Snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her lot. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't care. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, their son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. Harry Potter. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think it could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell quickly asleep, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed in the next street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner. The cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he just popped out of the ground.
Oh,
Tired?
I want to stop reading.
Sounds like a plan. We're halfway through this chapter anyway. We're on page 7 and there's 14 pages in this chapter, so that's a good place to stop. So let's put, this is our bookmark so we know where we are. Okay? I'm going to put that right in here. All right? That's our special bookmark, so you can't take it out. If you take that dollar bill out, then we will lose our place and we won't know where to start. And this is kind of one of those places where we can't just start over again because we're already reading for like 15 minutes. So anyway, that's a good cough. What you should do is definitely not cover your mouth when you cough. Good idea. All right, let's get into bed. We do some songs and it's time for you to get to bed because it's after 8. Good night, everybody.